Well, I want to welcome all of you to this video series. Kind of came out of my heart, out of my brain, and invited some friends to be a part of this. We all know how challenging, how awful this past 2 years, and still counting, has been. That our country, and in fact, too many of our churches have been so politicized and polarized and fractured over so many different things, and it has hurt the hearts of leaders, whether they're pastors or lay leaders. And so I thought I would bring Dr. Ken Miller in to help me talk about this. Many of you know him as a longtime theology professor, and I just think he has a lot to offer to this kind of conversation, as well as Steve Brubaker, who is the counseling pastor at Grace Community Church in Willow Street. And hopefully between the two of them, the next few weeks of videos will be helpful to us. I've struggled with what to call these. The word I keep hitting on is lamenting. It's not a word I use very often, and yet over the last couple of years, I've spent more time in the book of Lamentations probably than any other. And I'd like to read just one verse of scripture that I think describes maybe where we are as pastors and leaders, where the prophet says, "I will never forget this awful time as I grieve over my loss." This has been a time of loss for many of us, and we'll explore some of those areas of loss over this series of videos. But I'd like us to think, as we start, about this idea of lamenting. I found a quote recently from a leader, Josh Clemens of One Race, and he said, "Lament takes our painful stories and invites God into the pain and cleaves to his promises until they manifest. Lament leads to faith in God." And so as I throw that quote out to the two of you, I'd like you to just talk a little bit about this idea of lamenting and why it's important for us.
When I first saw that quote, my first thought was, that's not a violent enough description. As I look at the scriptural laments, whether it's in the Psalms, whether it's in the beginning of Job, or whether it's even with Jeremiah, there's something a little bit more going on than inviting. Now, I think overall it has the effect of inviting God into it, but the initial response is one of some absolute frustration, confusion, because there is a very serious and definite expectation of who God is and what God is about in protecting his people. There are those kinds of promises, and yet the prophet or any other person who is faced with an exceeding tragedy is confused because this does not add up with this. What I expect, what I know of God, is in absolute conflict with the way my life or the way the world or the way the nation is looking at this particular moment.
So, but we have trouble, I think, sometimes as Christians, as leaders, to admit that's where we are emotionally. So how do we do that?
Lament is also, I think, that which stands between pain and promise. And we don't like to talk about pain in the church. I grew up in a church atmosphere where the pastor seemingly never struggled with much of anything. And I'm not suggesting the pulpit should be a Freudian couch. But if the pastor can give a little bit of a glimpse that he's in process too, in the process of being sanctified, it kind of opens the door for others in the pew that are grappling with life's issues. But it's very hard for the pastor and the ministry leader to acknowledge.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. One of the books that I have found extremely helpful in teaching a God and Suffering course in the past was called Raging with Compassion by John Swinton, an Irishman. And he was relating the experience of a bombing when the IRA, or in this particular case, some group called the Real IRA, set off a bomb in downtown and had, by some accounts, the police were misled deliberately to herding people not away from where the bomb would go off, but towards it.
Oh.
And a couple of hundred people killed, many more injured, children, women, just a horrific incident.
Yeah.
And he related that when he went to worship that Sunday, he was waiting for the pastor to say something. They went through the scripture readings, nothing. Went through the prayers of the day, nothing. Went through the sermon, nothing. And he went home feeling rather empty. Our worship in many cases doesn't have room for lament. We don't have room for the things that lament implicates. Sadness, brokenness, questioning. And those are absolute necessary parts of any kind of healing from an emotional, psychological trauma such as comes about in these situations.
So the first step really is admitting this is the way we feel, that we have been hurt. We are wounded people.
Yes. But do our liturgies and our ecclesial practices make room for that?
Right.
Clearly, it's part of the scripture.
Absolutely.
There are so many times throughout the Psalms where David or one of the other psalmists is screaming at God, what's going on here? And you can even relate it to Jesus' experience on the cross. He's doing a number of things when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he's reciting Psalms, the whole Psalm, as was the practice. And you see so many things on the cross that are spoken in that entire Psalm. It's unbelievable if we aren't familiar with it. But to remove those passages from our worship, our worship is very good at expressing joy and love and praise and supplication, but not so good at inviting us to actually talk about God in the times when we have that sadness and that brokenness, and when we really are questioning who he is, what's going on, what he's allowing to take place, or in some other theological perspectives, what he's causing to take place.
Okay. Well, that's what we're going to talk about. That's a first step anyway, to admit, to be honest with God and with ourselves, of how we feel and how wounded and how hurt we are as pastors and as church leaders. And over the next few weeks, we'll talk about that more, do a little bit deeper dive into what it means to lament and to draw God, ask God to be a part of our lives in a deeper way.